We continue with our third session. As I explained early in the morning, the structure of this conference is to begin with witnesses about the situation elsewhere in the areas that produce the waves of immigration, to continue with the reactions of the churches to the waves of immigration, especially in this area, in LA area. And we'll continue now with the third focus of our conversation, of our conference, on the students, how not the churches but the universities, educational institutions accommodate the waves of refugees. Those institutions are of course connected with the churches, just like our university is connected with the Catholic Church, being a Jesuit university. We will listen now to the stories again and witnesses from the perspective of universities, of the schools, and those stories will be, I think, rather academic, and at the same time I hope they will also bring some cases and stories to your attention. Our first speaker in this session will be Lisa Unangst, who represents, well, an interesting center, I would say, a group of people who work at the Boston College, which is a very similar institution to ours. It's also a Jesuit institution, but it's on the other coast, on the East Coast in Boston. And there is actually a group of people who study professionally, academically, the issues pertinent to the education of immigrants in the institutions of higher education. And Lisa is one of those people. She's doing currently her PhD at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College. Her research interests include educational policy and practice supporting displaced students in comparative transnational context, international alumni affairs, and quantitative textual analysis. All those are her focuses. Lisa worked previously in higher education at Cal State East Bay and California Institute of Technology, Caltech, so she's familiar with this soil. She also worked at Harvard University. She has published in a number of academic journals like the Journal of Higher Education Policy and Management, the Journal for the Study of Post-Secondary and Tertiary Education, and Policy Reviews in Higher Education. So Lisa, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cyril, and thank you to Margaret and to the Institute for the invitation to be here today. I've been really looking forward to speaking with you, particularly after this morning of fascinating insight and conversation. Higher education is, of course, a philosophical and a practical enterprise, and I will be speaking about it today a bit more from the practical side of things, although I hope we'll have a chance to discuss the philosophical side as well. And a caveat, for the sake of brevity, I've used this title. When I refer to American universities, I am referring to higher education institutions. This includes colleges and universities, of course, and I refer to refugee students. In fact, as indicated by the introduction that was just given, I am interested in displaced students more broadly, so this includes asylees, refugees, and students who are classified as migrants by national governments, perhaps because they did not have access to an attorney who could have secured asylum status. So, brief outline of what we'll discuss today. We'll be moving quickly. I'm going to start with a description of what's happening on the ground internationally, which is where most refugees from the current crisis are residing. I'm using Germany as a case study, and we'll move then domestically to talk about the United States before I turn to sort of a more practical orientation towards specific strategies that I recommend that colleges and universities in the American context consider using. So, just as a general rule of thumb, I think that It's important to note that when we talk about Germany and the United States, we're talking about really vastly different higher education contexts. One indicator is the number of institutions. So Germany is a primarily public higher education system, and the number of institutions is around 400. The United States, of course, has a mix of the public and the private, but generally private institutions are seen as the most prestigious in this context, and there are roughly 4,000 accredited institutions. And just a few key facts about Germany to set the stage for this comparison. Of course, we're talking about a smaller population. We're talking about a context that has explicitly invested in the higher education access of refugee populations during the current influx. So Germany is somewhat unique in comparative context in that it allocated from the federal level 100 million euros specifically to support refugee higher education access. There has been a heavy investment in online education. And relevant for our discussion today, there are about 39 religious institutions that are currently listed by the sort of most authoritative source. This graph, indicating the number of refugees in the country compared to some other receiving contexts, is using data from 2017, so isn't the most up-to-date data, but gives you a sense of the scale of the number of refugees that have entered the country. Importantly, and this is also relevant in the American context, refugees and asylum seekers are not sort of evenly spread throughout Germany, right? So this map indicates where those refugees are concentrated. The green color indicates lower concentration of refugees, and we can see that this roughly mimics the border of us. And this has implications for public university system because universities respond to their current student body's needs, respect student body needs, and it indicates different programming budgets given. So again, just really talking about the comparative case, I mentioned that Germany allocated 100 million for the purposes of most of that money went for bridging programs that are first high school that prepare them to, and this slide indicates more than advantage. Again, we want to think the number of refugees per million. So what about actual degree? University, 3,000 students in college, 3. I think it's important to look is that huge dedicated to purpose, facilitating access, have in some ways resulted in perhaps a smaller than right? So this is one of them. The estimates for future enrollment that it range from about 2,000 to 10,000 degrees by 20, and the lower range could be about 17% of all universities. About 17% of all university applicants in Germany in 2017 from the refugee population were women. This is a statistic that we don't see frequently cited. It is something that German authorities, including the DAAD, are aware of and pointing to as an issue that needs to be addressed. Again, this is something that we might think about in the US context. So who is othered within the larger refugee population, within the larger student population, and who do programs target or serve. Of the refugee students who have successfully enrolled in these programs, we see that about 75% are from Syria. And interestingly, when we think about, quality assessment of these programs, these pathway programs, preparing students for university entry, we can think about one of the outcomes as being language level achieved. So something that is of concern in the German context is that quite a high level of German fluency is required to enter university. That is defined by the Council of Europe as a C1 level. And we see here in the last point that about 10% of students reached the C1 level of German at the conclusion of their pathway program in 2016. So again, we're seeing here, huge investment of funding, and in some ways, perhaps slightly less optimal results than we might have expected, right? This is the last slide I have on Germany. I do want to feature this heavy investment in online education, which has been much lauded, and I think much publicized. You may have seen this in the New York Times and elsewhere. Germany had an existing equivalent sort of the British Open University, the Fernuniversität, and those courses have been made free for refugee students, so they can take these at home as normal students. There's also this initiative that's been funded by the government, as well as Google, the BMW Foundation, and lots of other significant private funders, a student-driven initiative called Chiron University, which is meant to combine 2 years of online study with 2 years of study at a brick and mortar traditional college or university for free, to allow refugees to graduate with a bachelor's level degree. However, again, we see that initial results in this area are strikingly low. Of 1,500 students who've accessed this platform, the most recent numbers I saw indicated that 7 had graduated with a bachelor's degree. So we have some questions to ask about outcomes. So, religious higher education institutions in the United States, this may be familiar to folks in the room. The US hosts about 800 religiously affiliated institutions at present, and those institutions enroll about 1 million students. What are these institutions? There are lots of sources that one might go to in order to pull this information. Certainly the Southern Baptist Convention has its own list of affiliated institutions. Other conventions do as well. I used the National Center for Education Statistics data source, which operates a College Navigator. That website is listed here. Might be of interest if you ever want to play around and see how many institutions there are. And it lists, just as a sampling, the following institutions: 35 Jewish colleges, 2 Greek Orthodox colleges, 14 UCC colleges, etc. So an interesting smorgasbord of religious institutions in the United States. And how do we combine this with the presence of international students in the United States? So, among scholars who are interested in international students, refugee students are sort of a subset, right? So the larger umbrella would be scholars who study international students in the US. This might include students from China, India, South Korea, the top 3 sending countries to the US at the moment. And it's very clear that the international student mobility phenomenon supports the US higher education economy in an extremely substantial way, just as it does the UK, the Australian, and other higher education economies. So we see here that as an estimation by one of the main professional associations, NAFSA, estimates that about $39 billion is provided to the US economy on this front. And again, just emphasizing, why are international students important? Again, refugee students being a subsector. Yeah, international students now comprise about 5% of overall enrollment in the United States, so it's not an insignificant number. However, that share has dropped in recent years. There's still research being done and certainly speculation being done about why exactly this is, but we can see fall 2016, fall 2017, the share of new international student enrollment is dropping in the United States. What about California? What are we talking about when we talk about international students in California? Well, we're talking about a financial contribution of about $6.6 billion to the California economy. And here at Loyola Marymount, the estimate is that $62 million are contributed to the LMU operating budget through the enrollment of international students at all levels. That supports roughly 390 jobs. Not insubstantial. So we've given the background, right? This is the backbone of what's happening in the United States with respect to religious institutions, with respect to international students broadly speaking. And now just a bit of background about what is happening on the ground at colleges and universities with respect to refugee activity. So this is from an in-press book chapter in which I looked at institutions, accredited institutions in Maine and Idaho, both relatively rural states with a small number of higher education institutions. This was research done on the publicly available websites that reflected a hit for refugee activity. And the exercise here was to categorize what sorts of activity were taking place around refugees at these institutions. I list here the most common categories of refugee activity. The first being that a faculty profile at an institution mentioned an interest in refugees. The second, that there was a refugee student enrolled at the institution who was profiled. The third, that there was alumni activity around refugee support, typically through a nonprofit of some sort. And the fourth, that there was a conference or other substantive event taking place on the campus that had focused on refugees. What I think is remarkable from this list is that none of these four categories really represent a cohesive or concerted effort on the part of the higher education institution to support any coalescing group of students from a refugee background. A faculty member who has an interest in refugee issues may have been hired 10 years ago, 20 years ago, developed that interest independently. That may not have anything to do with the current influx. A refugee student profile is one individual, right? Not a community, not representing a larger, cohesive suite of programs. And in fact, in some cases, may be seen as a token. This may be an example of tokenism. Alumni activity around refugee support, again, typically related to the interest of an individual, not the institution itself. And the conference or substantive event is typically driven by an individual faculty member. So I'm pointing to these as examples of activity that is happening, but may represent tokenism in the American higher education sphere rather than an indication of cohesive and intentional effort at refugee student support. Talk about refugees in the US. We bandy about lots of numbers, lots of proportions. I have already done so. I wanted to provide just a few framing statistics here, again, for what this conversation is about. Compared to that German number we saw earlier, roughly 1.4 million, 17, we're talking about much lower numbers in the US context. The US admitted roughly 85,000 refugees in the fiscal year ending September 2016, so that's sort of the comparable data set, 85,000 to 1.4 million. And the origin of these refugees is a bit different, as we can see. DRC, Syria, Burma, Iraq, and Somalia. In the most recent data released that I was able to find, we see that about 8,000 refugees have been admitted between October 1 and February 15th. So very low numbers at this point that we're talking about. And I mention this, I emphasize this because I think this points to the ability of higher education institutions as individual actors and as coalitions, which I'll now move to discuss, to have a real impact on the lives of these refugees who are in the country. Importantly, as I think you may have gathered at this point, what we see here is that there is no single comprehensive U.S. effort to coordinate either the access of refugees to higher education or the support of refugees who are already enrolled in education. The closest thing to a comprehensive effort is represented by the Institute for International Education's Syria Consortium, which you may have heard about. That program was a voluntary program, asked individual colleges and universities if they'd like to sign up to be seen as supporting the resettlement of Syrian refugees and the study of Syrian refugees. That list, compared to the 4,000 that we saw earlier in that first graph, that first bar graph, is quite small. And in fact, of those institutions, 17 offer specific scholarships for refugees. So we see a difference between saying, yes, they can come here, and yes, they'll be funded to come here. Some of those scholarships are also partial scholarships, which just are not as helpful. So I'm going to propose a few things that I think colleges and universities should do now in the next few slides before offering a few concluding thoughts. One thing is that I think it's clear that active information sharing can be happening at the college and university level. So this is something that could be done here at LMU, Cal State LA, Cal State Long Beach. The chancellors and presidents could make a decision to take these actions, right? I'm suggesting that religious universities and perhaps university consortia like the AJCU, which LMU belongs to, establish centralized websites that manage applications and financial aid. That this consistent information mimic the U.S. Common Application, which has already been implemented and successfully implemented to support students in applying to different colleges in the U.S. This would streamline the process for refugees, their families, and support networks. I'm suggesting student ambassador or mentorship programs that are connecting institutions like LMU with high schools that serve refugee background students. The idea being that students would be providing sort of an honest insider view of what being at college is like. They'd be offering informal Q&A sessions, and that this might help smooth that pipeline, that K to 16 pipeline, to enable more refugee students to access higher ed. And family and support network engagement is key in terms of information sharing. It is the case that many refugee background students do not have a nuclear family with them, so colleges and universities need to think more, perhaps not just about a nuclear family, but about friends, about who are serving as supports for them in accessing higher education and then succeeding in higher education. These might include, from the university's perspective, virtual family weekend events to allow that support network to feel connected to the institution, to know what's happening in the student's life, to offer free or low-cost on-campus housing to facilitate friend and family visits to campus. And all of these services, I believe, should be offered the most relevant languages for the local refugee background population. So colleges and universities have a natural advantage in that they have access to lots of folks who speak lots of languages on their campuses, right? Typically, most admissions offices and student services offices offer information exclusively in English. Why is that? There are two examples here from the University of Cincinnati and the University of Buffalo of institutions that are offering online tours of the campus in distinct languages relevant to the local refugee populations, and also fact sheets about the application and financial aid process. This is something that really would be quite low cost and easy to achieve. Wraparound services. So if folks here have a background in social work, this is probably a really familiar term, this idea that, as individuals, we have not just one need at any given time, but we have a host of needs that can be comprehensively addressed. Now, this is not to say that the university ever could or should meet every person's need in every area of their life. However, we do see across the country that colleges and universities for other minoritized students are offering a suite of services, including food banks, transportation services, child care, specific job counseling, mental health services, tutoring, emergency funds, and so forth that help those minoritized students to succeed in the higher education that they have already accessed so that they can graduate on time. I encourage institutions to consider expanding these services to specifically target refugee background students, and if they are not in place, to consider implementing these services at least on a pilot basis. Options following graduation. So this hasn't been talked about too much today, although we've touched upon the intricacies of legal status in the United States for folks from a refugee or asylee background. One of the challenges for students from those backgrounds who manage to access higher education is, depending on their legal status, they may have to leave the country immediately after graduation. I am offering that I think colleges and universities could anticipate this and perhaps think about preparing a mode of entry into post-graduation work to take advantage of the OPT option, the optional practical training that graduating students receive in this country, and also to think about streamlined pipelines into graduate programs so that students would then be able to stay on a student visa and continue advanced training. Again, this is something that actually already exists in the United States. There are a number of programs that offer entry into a bachelor's level pre-med program that guarantee entry into medical school. So essentially, you're guaranteed entry into a 7 or an 8-year program. Why can't we do this for different kinds of concentrations, and perhaps amongst consortia, right? It doesn't have to be only at one institution. This could be about partnerships between different institutions. And then support for on-site research. So a recent commentary by a colleague of mine who's now back at Istanbul University noted that he observed and problematized a lack of on-site research around refugee education. That essentially lots of Western researchers were doing online research to try and discuss some of the problems that refugee students were encountering in countries like Turkey, Lebanon, etc. He called for action in this area. And I add to that I think a way to make this on-site research happen, which would inform not only policy making, but I think the programs and policies of higher education institutions, is for funders to take a look at the situation and to commit to funding students and faculty members to do on-site research related to refugee education. I also challenge colleges and universities to consider how they could do this on a smaller scale, and suggest here that if each college and university in that Syria consortia, or ideally the entire US landscape, committed to fund one student and one faculty member for one research project a year on refugee education, this would really have a substantial impact and is not a significant budget line item. So, concluding thoughts, we've covered lots of data, lots of suggestions. Takeaways are, there are lots of active programs in the US context that currently serve marginalized groups, including first-generation students, underrepresented minority backgrounds, lower socioeconomic status students, and I suggest that these can be adapted to serve the needs of refugee background students. Second, intentional planning and collaboration across higher education institutions, as well as consortia of those institutions, is called for, and resources deployed in this area can draw not only from university budgets, but also from the time, expertise, and contributions of constituents including alumni, community partners, the folks in this room. And third, I'd like to just highlight again, I think that the suggested interventions here are really on a spectrum in terms of intensity with respect to resources. And it's clear that indeed change in this area is achievable at the individual campus level. A legacy of meaningful inclusion would be a testament to any institution as well as its leadership. Thanks so much.
Very much, Lisa. We will do our best to deliver these messages and suggestions to the leadership of our university. They're really helpful. And now I'd like to invite our last speaker, last but not least. And I'm very glad that he will be speaking last because it will be a treat. It's a huge success story, if you want. It's like a sweet. I'm speaking about Michael Hjelm, who's the dean of an institution in Sweden, which is known as St. Ignatius Academy. Now it's a part of of the University College of Stockholm, which also includes the Stockholm School of Theology and the Stockholm School of Human Rights. Well, this institution, this school, which is kind of multi-layer institution with all the levels of education, including high education, consists mostly of immigrants. The majority of the students in this institution are immigrants, and at the same time, this institution achieved really remarkable successes. Like it is considered to be the fastest growing institution in Sweden. From the place number 160 or so, it jumped to the 16th. Place in the Swedish rank of the institutions of higher education, and I think it is among the leading growing institutions in Sweden, which is a remarkable achievement given that it consists mostly of immigrants. So most students who come to study there are from the Middle East and Northeastern Africa. They are Christians, mostly from the Eastern traditions, and Muslims. The seminary the institution has 4 seminaries: Byzantine, Coptic, Syriac, and Tewahedo, which includes Ethiopian and Eritrean traditions. So students from those traditions, including Muslim students, they learn to live together, to overcome hostilities to each other that they often experience in their home countries, and to accommodate themselves to the Western democratic society. The unique method of Michael's school is that it facilitates this kind of reconciliation not through secular discourses, which are common in the Western academia, but through theology, not by excluding religion, but by including religion to the curriculum. Religious traditions, which are dear to most refugees who come to study in the school, can contribute to the accommodation of immigrants to the Western society better than secularism. So Michael believes, and I really concur with this idea. So this is the basic belief and approach of St. Ignatius, which, quite surprisingly, is supported by the Swedish government, which is regarded one of the most secular in the world. And yet they pour a lot of money into an institution that teaches theology and moreover uses theology to reconcile those students with the wider society. I should say that we at the Huffington Ecumenical Institute are very proud to have cooperation with St. Ignatius, with this school. And we signed a memorandum of understanding with the school last year. So through this conference, we essentially fulfill our commitment to this cooperation with the school. I invite Michael to tell us more about, to express his thoughts about the topic of the conference and to tell us more about his school. Please.
Okay, you hear me? I will present the vision for what it means to live in a world that will continuously be handling strangers, refugees, and asylum seekers. When I started working at St. Ignatius, we were approximately 12 students, and we had 90% of teachers. Today we have approximately 40 teachers, and we have approximately 525 students. So it's quite a growth just in a few years. Fortunately, we have been paid by the government, but with that, we have a lot of regulations, a word that Cyril Havarun doesn't want us to say. But that's the case, that we have a lot of regulations that covers our every step. Now, a vision for how to handle the present crisis and everything that comes with it. I will primarily hold my speech in relation to a kind of philosophical outlook on this. 25 years ago, I compared various Baptist congregations here in the US, and I remember 2 visits in Birmingham, here in the US. My first visit was to a predominantly white parish, where they received me with open arms, but with tea in one hand and the Bible in the other. After some words of courtesy, they asked me whether I was saved or not. As an Orthodox, I believe that salvation belongs to the coming kingdom, so my straightforward answer was, no, not yet. I realized that this was clearly not the right answer, and after 1 hour of trying to persuade me to receive Christ in my life, I managed to get out from a parish. The day after, I went to a predominantly black parish, where I was received by the Reverend Pastor, and even though we talked about salvation, faith and hope, I felt immediately at home. After an hour, I asked him how come I feel like I belong here, despite having a different confession. His answer was compelling, and a prelude to my future engagement as a philosopher and as a theologian. He told me that even though the Afro-Americans were born and raised through generations in Birmingham, they still feel as strangers in their own hometown. The parish did not change this. They were still strangers in the parish. Strangers in a different land that was unknown and different from this world. But they were welcomed strangers. Welcomed by the one who loves strangers. The one who himself became a stranger. This humble welcome extends to our visitors, the pastor argued, and they share this estrangement with us. I realized that he was right. I was still a stranger, but a welcome stranger. And above everything else, I was accepted as a stranger, without any attempt to turn me into anything else. This evolved in my thinking as a practical philosophy. How am I to address refugees and newcomers in Sweden? Not to turn them into something different, to accept them as strangers. This also revealed a different eschatology, a much more realistic and humble eschatology, where the beginning of a journey toward the eschaton is not an estrangement to this world as Christians would be different from everyone else. But in fact, it's an estrangement towards the coming kingdom. In this estrangement, we experience the border of existence, where anxiety, fear, and moments of meaninglessness are endured through faith, which in turn is experienced as a welcome address for Christians from the Father through the Son in the Holy Spirit. In this eschatology, the borders remain and can only be transcended with patience, endurance, and solidarity. The gradual transformation from estrangement in regard to the kingdom toward the domesticity of the kingdom is connected with the transformation of cosmos, where the welcome stranger is the departure. So, these borders are most important for me since this experience in Birmingham. So in this lecture, I would like to present a kind of humble approach towards the stranger, towards accepting that we are all strangers in some sense, as a memory of where we come from. The identification with the stranger is a theme that recurs already in Deuteronomy, where it becomes a confession in front of the Lord. Quote, "You are to declare before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt, few in number, lived there, and became a great nation, mighty and numerous." This verse seems to be the core in the Jewish Haggadah, where the exact translation has been under scrutiny in Jewish tradition, and multiple conflicting interpretations appears in Mishnah and in later commentaries. Though the reason why it is important has to do with Genesis 15:13-16. Quote, "Your seed shall be a stranger in the land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them. Afterward they shall come out with great wealth, and the fourth generation shall come here again." The language in Genesis is clear and direct. Israel shall become a stranger, Gerut, who will serve ours Avdut and be afflicted Inui. The text in Genesis refers to the people of Israel, but has a parallel story in Deuteronomy where it instead refers to Jacob, who went down to Egypt as a stranger. The story, nevertheless, has a prelude that makes it more important, and that is the reason why he walks down to Egypt. In Haggadah, it is interpreted as Laban tricked Jacob and delayed the marriage with Rachel, which meant that Joseph, instead of being firstborn, became the envy of his brothers, which led Jacob and the people of Israel to become strangers. But this estrangement is later turned into a successful story. Joseph is sold as a slave, but appears before Pharaoh and becomes great. In a similar way, Christ appears as a stranger in front of his own people who do not receive him, and he is crucified, but this is turned into victory in the resurrection. Finally, this also counts in regard to the church, who is persecuted, but who waits its final victory in the eschaton. The tradition of Passover Haggadah reveals the structure of estrangement as a path toward reconciliation, where the reading begins as ritual remorse on how Laban destroyed my father and forced him into estrangement. But before the end of the reading, it is turned into joy, remembering that the estrangement was turned into greatness in the house of Pharaoh. Estrangement seems to be the core of the books of Moses. It seems to be the ground position whereby the theme of reconciliation is presented, both in the Torah and in the New Testament. Estrangement is a recurring theme in the books of Moses, where people of Israel is constantly reminded to care for a stranger, remembering that they also have been strangers. For example, in Leviticus 19:34, quote, "You must treat the foreigner living among you as native born and love him as yourself. For you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." The theme comes back in several passages, for example in Deuteronomy 10:19, with almost the same content. In one passage, it becomes clear that the caring for this foreigner is a command that is general, in the sense that it is the prime model for how to behave positively to one's fellow human being. Quote Leviticus, "If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you." From this passage, we clearly can see that the stranger was not someone to profit upon, but who was to be taken care of, which followed the multiple commandments of God in the Torah. This is also taken up in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which must be read from within a Jewish tradition. The Jew is supposed to care for a stranger, but instead it is the most estranged, the Samaritan, who cares for a stranger. This is also underlined in Matthew 25:35. Quote, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me." Welcoming the stranger seems to be at the core of what it means to be a Jew as well as being a Christian. But perhaps the most striking example is the passage by St. Paul who says in his letter to the Galatians 3:28, quote, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Unquote. This makes it abundantly clear that overcoming estrangement stands out as a core teaching of a church, which is rooted in the Torah. God is the one who loves strangers to an extent that he himself became a stranger. One of the most important thinkers in regard to xenophilia, loving the stranger, is Paul Tillich, who was exiled to America when the takeover of a nationalist socialist party happened in the 1930s. He experienced the cruelty of the First World War at first hand as military chaplain, an experience which was one of the major sources for shaping his philosophical outlook. The second major experience was the takeover of the Nazi regime, where they burned books, among them Tillich's book, Die Sozialistische Entscheidung, and the subsequent discrimination of dissidents. This forced him into exile in a country whose language and culture was completely alien to him. Tillich identified the Christian tradition and its central symbols with the border of human existence. In his book, Auf der Grenze, 1936, Tillich explores the meaning of border, at the same time as he tried to recover his identity as a resident alien teaching at Union Theological Seminary. Faith, in his understanding, is belief in God at the borders of non-being, which therefore go hand in hand with despair, fear, and the sense of meaninglessness, including anomie. Faith in Tillich's thinking becomes not just belief in God, but also the endurance of being at the border of non-being, which becomes visible in experience of a stranger. Every human being suffers the consequences of being at the existential border, which forms the human identity. This makes border a primary locus theologicus in Tillich's thinking. The border is defined by Tillich as three pairs of opposites. First, people face the polarization of individualization and participation. In order to overcome this polarity, we have to find a balance between our own aspirations and desires and our self-perception on the one hand, and one's orientation towards community and one's part in the community on the other hand. In this process, we must be cautious and avoid extremes and not focus on only just one pole at a time. The other two pairs of opposites that determine the human life are the polarities between dynamics and form and between freedom and fate. The creative potential inherent in every human being that urge him, her to recreate him or herself and creatively rearrange the world, dynamics, becomes hubris or absurdity without limitations imposed by rules, form. Without form, creativity becomes incommunicable and easily evolve into chaos. Likewise, we live in the tension between freedom and fate. Even though we can determine the end of our lives and the path toward our end, freedom, we remain dependent on our part of history and our part of society, which also determines our actions, fate. Therefore, as individuals, we must negotiate the difference between activity and passive endurance in interaction with the living conditions of the world. Tillich positions these basic polarities on the level of essential analysis. The threat of non-being breaks through in the actualization of being. Existence, according to Tillich, implies living between the three polarities described above. In the end, this is where the threat of non-being becomes clear, and the courage to be showing and proving itself in the tangible life. Every human being has to fight for integration and balance, because life confronts him with guilt, loneliness, fear, tragedy, death, and meaninglessness, which Tillich identifies as a threat of non-being. Experience the borders of existence are thus part of every human life and cannot be eradicated. Confronted with non-being, a person could find herself as competent to deal with these experiences. He or she cannot conquer the limitation of his or her own identity, but one can still one still can act at these borders. The courage to resist guilt, fear, meaninglessness, and so on, and the success of this effort are just as much part of human existence. Consequently, we try to conquer our brokenness and the threat of non-being. This is how one can achieve self-integration with a view to moral acting, self-creation with a view to culture, and self-transcendence with a view to religion, with the latter to a certain extent encompassing the other two. However, the real conquest of alienations by non-being will only succeed for a short moment in time, and only to a certain extent. Moreover, human experiences their practical courage to be as something that is not solely based on their own capacities. At the border of the utter threat of non-being, human experience points beyond the self and transcends individual possibilities. Therefore, a person can act at the boundaries of non-being, but this is also where his abilities end. At this point, Tillich introduces central symbols and traditions of Christianity. He shows a God that reveals God's self as a source of unlimited courage and the deepest ground of humanity's courage to be. The individual who, in spite of his or her competence in acting at the external borders, ultimately experiences him or herself as a stranger to him or herself and to God. The individual can feel touched by God's revelatory event. A person can accept this event through faith, but in such a way that a position at the border between being and non-being is not abolished. Rather, faith itself remains fragmented in time and history, and therefore needs a constant representation in the community, church. Faith does not help one to cope with the borders of existence completely. In a whole lifetime, we still have to believe as we cross countless boundaries. Crossing boundaries also becomes part of a story of redemption. The ultimate crossover is between being and non-being, which is closely connected with creation, death, and resurrection. The journey towards this crossover follows the boundary of existence with all its tribulations. From words of Christ, we are to carry each other in these tribulations, sharing food, housing, and material benefits for life, but also to share comfort, relief, and hope. The story of reconciliation of a stranger is perhaps most strikingly present in the story about Jacob passing over the creek of Jabbok. This is the story. When Jacob had sent his family over the creek of Jabbok, he finds himself left alone, a stranger, deprived of his family, which makes him despair, which is portrayed as a wrestle with the angel. The more he struggles, the more powerful the angel becomes, and finally he is struck on his hip and loses his dignity, following the Jewish commentaries. Defeated, he holds on to the heel of the angel as a last resort and say that he would let loose unless the angel blesses him, which is a blessing by God, and he is resurrected and given the name Israel because he has wrestled with God. Before the blessing, he must accept his fate as a stranger. Before he can be reconciled with his family, which later on becomes a picture of passing from this world to the coming kingdom. This is a story that pictures the balance between self-determination and the contingencies that has already predetermined our existence. We have a similar story in the book of Job, who loses everything, and it's not until he accepts his estrangement that he can reconcile with God. While the friends cannot accept this estrangement, and therefore they are left outside the story of redemption. Xenophilia is, in this respect, a sign of accepting your own estrangement, which becomes an important part of your own reconciliation and redemption. In the Torah, as well as in the teaching of Jesus, this becomes apparent, but also in Tillich's theology, where the remembrance of being a stranger becomes a bulwark of his practical theology. This is also part of a monastic spirituality. Saint Anthony the Great passes through 3 stages before he is reconciled with his present situation and finally leaves his solitude and begins teaching. First, he is afflicted by a lion for 7 years that represents loneliness, And it is not until he accepts his loneliness and makes room for the lion to be with him in the cave that he is reconciled. Secondly, he faces demons who represents death, who almost defeat him. But when he accepts death, they fade away. Finally, in the third stage, he is faced with the ultimate challenge: to accept his estrangement to the heavenly world, which passes him from a high altitude of angels to lowliness of humanity, which is the genesis of the incarnation. This compels him to meet his fellow human beings and tell them the story of redemption which he has endured at the borders of existence. The borders of existence become even more apparent when we introduce them into the field of ecclesiology. The first pair of individuality and participation implies in ecclesiology that the church must find a balance between a particularity in its own confession and the participation with other confessions, religions, and the external society. Without a broader participation outside its own confessional borders, the so-called exopraxis, estrangement is turned into nationalism, which creates closed borders. The examples are multiple in Eastern Orthodoxy, where the Church's primary concern is the endopraxis, internal practice of a church, not only limited to the confession, but even limited to the national church. And bishops who exist outside these national borders often tell the story about conflicts regarding values such as academic freedom and the freedom to speak. On the other hand, without the endopraxis, the church loses its own voice and becomes deprived of its own identity. This was actually what happened during the oppression by the Bolsheviks and oppression by the Ottomans. The church was reduced to its own liturgy without even interacting in the liturgy after the liturgy. Instead being thrown out in an exopraxis without any roots in a functioning internal practice. When the Iron Curtain was torn apart, it became visible that the exopraxis of Eastern Christianity was more or less alien in relation to its internal praxis. And now we see a dismantling of a church exopraxis in Eastern Christianity. The imbalance between these two practices has created very serious internal conflicts in Eastern churches that divorce them from inside. This also becomes visible in relation to the refugee crisis. With this imbalance, the church tries to reconstruct its failed endopraxis by the help of a civil society, where the nation is defined in terms of its faith, and nationalism is defined along religious borders, and refugees are defined as welcome strangers or not, depending on their religious affiliation. In the same way, the church must also find a balance between its own creativity in forming its self-identity and its own cultural values, as well as being able to participate in the universal and ecumenical world, in exactly inhabited world. The universal values are discussed, such as human rights and international law. Without being able to participate in a discourse of universal values, estrangement is turned into alienation, which easily adopts protectionism and securities as its prime ideology. In this regard, the church can be engaged in the international discussion, but protects its particular cultural values on the expense of universal values, and can even justify war if it is connected with these values. As an example of how this rhetoric functions, we can take Patriarch Kirill's speech in Tyumen, Russia. Quote from Patriarch Kirill. On the other hand, we consider how, with the help of human rights, a cover is laid over lies in order to hurt religious and national sentiments. In addition, ideas from human rights are integrated step by step that are not acceptable, not only to Christians, but generally to everyone who have a traditional moral understanding of a human being. Another quote in the same speech. Unfortunately, contemporary international law is evolving in the direction of deepening the views of various minorities on the expense of a majority of humanity. In the private sphere, the freedom to make moral choices must be as complete as possible. However, in the public arena, only those values can be supported and disseminated that are supported by the majority of a people. The church is here, then often at odds with universal values such as human rights, which creates a front against other societies, often predicting them to collapse without an eye to their own upcoming collapse. In the same way, the church must find a balance between its own self-determination, founded in eschaton, and the reality that determines its existence in this world. The liturgy reveals our common goal every Sunday, the eschaton, which could be interpreted either as a common kingdom or a transformation of this world. In both cases, it is a future existence where they expect that estrangement has been transcended. The problem when self-determination clouds the contingencies that exist in this life, estrangement seems to be lost and borders seems to vanish. Though they still exist, and they still create fear, anxiety, sorrow, and despair. When the church turns toward metaphysics, it often idealizes reality, where bishops become corporate personalities, neglecting a huge problem that the ministry of bishops constitutes, or the ontologize canons in the sense that the canons becomes icons of a common kingdom instead of protecting the church against the abusement of power. This creates an illusion of reality where human beings are left at the borders with the dream of passing to the land of their dreams, and images of ancienity is born, such as the ancient Rus, ancient Hellas, or ancient Serbia. But the anxieties and fear remains and is even increased in utter disappointment at the borders, which creates deep sense of meaninglessness and an aggression, which is the case in Russia. Two final things. In a huge investigation that was conducted by the Levada Institute and World Value Survey 2007 to 2014, we find a growing aggression among youths. In one of the surveys, we find that youth between the age of 18 and 24 in Russia thinks, for example, that alcoholics should be liquidated, 8%. Homeless children should be better off to be liquidated, 2%. Disabled, 2%. Homeless, 9%. Mentally ill, 4%. Numbers that has increased just recently and continue to increase in the modern Russian society. When it comes to the refugee crisis, it follows the pattern of this crisis also. Borders are closed, not with the help of non-Christians, but in fact by the help of Christians in the European world. Refugees coming to Sweden are often handled as enemies or aliens that should be hindered to come into Sweden. And primarily this is done not by non-Christians, but by Christians. Not by atheists, but by Christians today in Europe. And the reason is that we have transcended our own estrangement and created a kind of home feeling that makes others strangers and not ourselves. And in Orthodoxy, we have created a kind of eschatology that makes us escape the reality, where they transcend the borders, believing that borders should be dismissed by the church. But we have to remain at the borders. We have to remain at the borders with our anxieties, our emotions, our pain, and everything. The coming kingdom is on the other side and still needs to be something that we work for together with those that are strangers. Thank you.
Time for Q&A to our speakers. Who wants to be first? Well, before you decide to come up and ask your questions, I'd like to ask a question myself. I'd like Michael to explain in more detail about his school, what you do, and how do you accommodate those refugees? How you make it possible? And I think it is really an example for other schools. So exemplify it, please.
If I take my theme, that was a little bit more. One important thing that I think is the basis of what we're working with, and this is what I think is important. You hear me? Yeah? And that is the new spirituality that has come forth in the second half of the 20th century. That is the illusion that religion is a kind of escape from this reality into another reality. If we remember that the 60s were very much about how to handle reality, the end of the 20th century has meant in many respects that Christianity has been reshaped, especially in Orthodoxy, but in almost every corner of Christianity and other religions also. That religion has become something for rich people, if I would be honest. And we have lost these ideals that are connected with our struggle for poor people and neglected people. It's not strange that whenever I lecture around Europe and the world, I see empty halls when we concern issues today that concerns poor people, neglected, and so on. That's a new situation. When I started in the 80s, this was the central themes. It has changed. And when I look at my own confession, eschatology has become a kind of ideal thing. And I think that philosophers like Paul Tillich, thinkers from the 60s and 70s, we need to go back to their thinking. We need to understand the need of being at the borders, to understand the need that our life in sharing has to be sharing in pain, and not just sharing from a rich position to poor position. To understand that they both are strangers, both people living in the Western world as well as people living in Africa and so on. And when it comes to St. Ignatius and our institution, I think we have worked hard to establish a spirituality that makes people feel that they are not they don't need to change to become, part of a Swedish society. They can still be strangers in a society that is alien for them, and also to identify and understand that we share in this estrangement, instead of idealize things, to talk about ideal positions or situations, so to say. This has become successful in our school, in the sense that we have been able to gather several different cultures in one school. We have happily avoided a lot of conflicts due to this. That's, I think, is the most important thing. And I think the idealization that we have been experiencing in the end of the 20th century has become our major enemy today.
Give more data about the school. I mean, the students, what kind of students study there, what kind of backgrounds they have, and where they actually end up, what they achieve.
We have 527 students. 212 are from the Eastern Africa. 85 from the Syriac Orthodox Church, and 100 approximately from the Coptic Orthodox Church, and then finally the Byzantines are the rest, so to say. We have approximately a couple of percentage, that's not so many, but a couple of percentage are Muslims studying mainly in the refugee courses. 92% are refugees or immigrants that has arrived in the second generation or in the first generation. And that's more or less.
what kind of achievements they have, how they integrate into the society, what kind of jobs they have because, well, Lisa mentioned the example of the German universities, which, despite of the influx of money from the federal government, produce actually a dozen or so students with degrees. I think the situation with your school is different. Can you explain more what they get after the school as a result of their studies?
And most of them get jobs, so it's, yeah, that's and that's unique because I think 80% of the people studying at our school get a new job, either as priests or as deacons, but deacons are more or less kind of voluntary work, or they continue with higher studies at university, because we have the ability to get them into higher studies. If they pass our school, then they get a place at the university. The government has given a lot of money to the refugee crisis. It's not just Germany. Actually, in percentage, we have given more in Sweden than Germany in relation to the refugees. As you saw, number 5 in the list, right, is Sweden. Yeah, okay. Yeah. But Sweden belongs to the top countries that has received immigrants. And in percentage, they are number 1. Yeah. You know that.
But I write about Germany.
Okay. So it's actually, in comparison with the number of inhabitants in Sweden, Sweden is the number 1 country in Europe to receive immigrants. Germany has received more, but they are a bigger country than Sweden.
Well, I think I've heard the statistics that Sweden has received more immigrants from Iraq and Syria than the US and Canada together.
Yeah, that's correct.
And the small country of Sweden has accommodated.
Yeah, I think that there are more Syriacs living in Sweden today and in Syria, right? Yeah.
They have the largest cathedral in the world, right? Which is
the 3 largest, right? They compete on which one is the biggest. Yeah.
Any other question from the floor, please? Don't be shy.
I'll just add, I think that advocating for the integration. A number of pieces have been written about to each other. But I think as someone who focuses on and in some ways it's an idea of massive one-time government investment. What actually happens, thank you, what actually happens so what happens when you put a lot of money into a national system?
Just a question about the Coptic Orthodox students. What's their background? Are they refugees, or they came from Egypt and going back to Egypt?
We have 2 kinds of students. We have Copts coming from Egypt that only study at our school, and they have granted a scholarship, and they return to Egypt. And then we have refugees. Number of refugees in the Coptic seminary, I don't have a clear-cut picture, but I think it's approximately half. The rest are from Sweden, that comes from. Normally, Copts are a privileged refugee group. They are a little bit richer than other groups in the Middle East. when it comes to Sweden. It means that they have high aspirations and they study at higher education institutions, mostly. It means that I would say approximately everyone goes to higher studies. So if they study at our institution, they usually aspire an MA, or they study on lower levels in our school in order to get into the university. That's the two possibilities for Copts. While if you compare with the Eritreans, who literally cannot read and write when they come, literally cannot read and write, they have to pass the really lower levels and learn to read and write. First, learn to read and write in their own language, Tigrinya, and then learn English and Swedish, and then the basics for entering into university. They often give up and they began to work with lower kind of jobs. So that's the two other groups. Mostly in our school, it's mostly in English. There are more people speaking English in Sweden than Swedish. Yeah.
Maybe tell more about the cooperation with the Coptic Patriarchate, which I think is very promising.
Coptic Patriarchate, we are starting a research school in Cairo. The initiative came from the Coptic Diocese from the beginning. Then it has evolved into a center in Logos Papal Institute for Research and Higher Education. It's a complete new situation for Coptic Church in Egypt. The present Pope and Patriarch, he is much more in favor of having academic freedom, having structures for education in Egypt that has never been the case before. So that's we are only supporting the research school in Egypt, nothing else at the moment. But it's a new wave of intellectual entrepreneurship in Egypt that we haven't seen before, which will affect the Middle East, I believe, clearly. I don't know what is Syriac Orthodox Church. They have a university, but in Syria, but yeah.
Well, I'll ask a question that you can both answer from your own perspective, and that is, every Thanksgiving, I go, I don't want to, it's a complicated situation. So my older brother, his father-in-law, I'll ask each of you to kind of address this, hates the idea of money being spent on foreigners when he feels that, citizens here in the United States are being given the short shaft. So my question is simple. Michael, in your terms, how would you talk to somebody like that in the terms of your argument that my father-in-law has, or my older brother's father-in-law has got to make his way to the border and stay there? And I'm interested also, just given the fact that there's so much governmental support, how that affects your thinking. And then in your case, given the fact that there's so much tremendous resistance and kind of disorganization and even a lack of a common language to talk about the problem, what would you say to my brother's father-in-law?
Great question. So I would say a few things. One is, as we heard earlier today, I think Cyril mentioned this, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other elements of the UN and human rights discourse guarantee equal access to education, including tertiary education when possible. 1% of refugees worldwide are currently enrolled in tertiary education per the UNHCR. And so I think it's clear that there is a humanitarian argument to be made on the basis of the human rights dialogue, which some of these documents the US is signatory to. And I think it's clear that as conflict states move towards resolution, they will need well-educated leaders to guide them towards peace and reconciliation. Those leaders frequently will have gained tertiary level education. There's also an economic argument to be made for those same present conflict states, as well as these permanent, semi-permanent, in some cases, receiving countries like the United States, Canada, Germany. Germany is quite explicitly making the economic argument that by investing in refugees and higher education, that it will recover itself from its serious demographic crisis and economic labor shortage.
This is a very difficult question. First of all, in Sweden, the so-called Swedish Democrats, they have increased in number. They were organized during the Nazi era in Sweden. So that's an old Nazi party from beginning. Today they have 25% of the votes in Sweden. And this has mainly to do with the recent immigration crisis. I just looked at their party program here, where they say that they are against all kinds of multiculturalism, where they understand that Sweden must protect its culture, identity, and nation. Guests can be welcome if they are a protected minority, but otherwise they are to be organized by the state. That's what I say in this. This is frightening because it means that we have 25% of population actually voting for this party in Sweden. It means that there are even more that supports them. So we are talking about a divided country. Half are open to receive immigrants and support them. The second half are completely against it. And we have a similar situation in France now, beginning to see the numbers in Germany. In Austria, it's already a majority that are against it. It's just a matter of a new election. The Brexit crisis here has a lot to do with the immigration crisis in Europe. But the second thing is that who has created this immigration crisis? It's not America, it's Europe, by how they exploited the Middle East during the 19th century and how they completely left everything in a kind of ruins after their term in the Middle East. They divided everything between them. The British take command of Jewish interest, the Russians of Armenian interest, and the French of Catholic interest. But they didn't take any responsibility. And this has created a situation there. There's no networks of defense or safety nets when the crisis occurs in the Middle East, like it has happened now with ISIS and everything. Europe has created this, but it hasn't taken any kind of responsibility. We live in an era of forgetting our history. Europe has a colonial history that has affected the Middle East and Northern Africa very clearly. That's the second answer I would say. That the third thing is that. And that is something that I think religious people, not just Christians, but at least Jews and Christians, should be very aware of. That loving the stranger, it's part of the core of our teaching. It has been since the beginning of time through the Old Testament, or the Torah, and through the Christian tradition up to the present time. But in the recent 40 or 50 years, this is beginning to fade away. When I was in Birmingham, it's 25 years ago, it still was present in these ideas and so on. Same visit today in Birmingham, I see it's also fading away here in America. The stranger has become an enemy. That is what happens before war comes about. That really frightens me. And if we don't receive the stranger, it means that we open our arms to, or we create an enemy instead of a welcome stranger. The ISIS crisis and everything has very much to do with how we have acted towards the people in the Middle East, I would say.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your answers. And I think the concluding words of Michael's answer could be a conclusion to our conference, a summary of what we have discussed. I think it has been a very good discussion, a very good conference. We learned a lot, and I hope we will disseminate the conclusions of each paper, panel discussion that we had among our own folks. We'll bring something with us from this conference. Please spread the word about what you've heard about the the immigration crisis among your own people. And again, thank you for coming. Thank you for staying with us all this long day. It's unusual for us to keep you so long in this conference, but it seems that it worked well, I hope. Still, you are tired, I know. That's why it is time for some refreshment, some treatment. So it's time for the party. Please join us for the reception. And again, thank you to the speakers.